It's a continuation of our meeting on Tuesday.
I'll gavel in this continued meeting from December 18th of the Anchorage Assembly. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Borowski. Here. Mr. Weddleton.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Croft.
Here.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Trainee.
Present.
Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Constant. Ms. Wamehoff.
Here.
Mr.
Present.
Dyson. Chair Croft, you have a quorum.
Good. We'll recognize when Mr. Constant gets here, and then Mr. Dyson had asked to be excused, and that should be reflected. He had an injury to his eye. He's at home, but he is going to asked us to call when we were close to voting on this matter. The sole matter we have before us is 14P, ordinance number AO 2018-104. We've already read the title and had public testimony. We're in the debate, amendment, and passage section.
But we also have
Yeah, we do.
We have Q. Oh, well, right.
Which we intend to delay. But we'll have to do public hearing on it, testimony on it.
We have 14P and Q, they're right. So 14P is the alcohol tax and 14Q is the increase in consumption times. No, we've already, this is kind of a democratic joint effort that people just yell out stuff. We did the pledge and we did everything else, just the roll call needed to be done to establish who is here. Mr. Vice Chair, do you want to call up 14Q and we can just move that? Because I intend, it's my proposed ordinance with Mr. Dunbar, and we were going to move it, Mr. Dunbar, to when? Yeah, to, I think even the February 12th. So if we could get a motion to change the order of the day, bring up 14Q, and then we'll move it to a date certain.
I move to change the order of the day to bring up 14Q before 14P.
Any objection to that?
No objection, though. We'll have to open public hearing tonight on that. And then we can continue it. Rather than close public hearing, I suggest we continue it to that date certain.
Good. So it is, if there's no objection to moving the agenda?
one objection.
Yes?
I want to deal with P first.
We think if we bring up Q, we'll just postpone it. We won't.
I just don't
Bring
want
up
public testimony in Q to start now.
That's your
and delay
proposal,
the
Mr.
process.
Dunbar?
I have no, we can take it in either order. I just wanted to note that if we do take up Q now, we have to do public testimony on it.
That's fine.
Maybe Mr. Chairman? We could just let it die, too. We could not move and second it. We could let it die, and then we could reintroduce it.
Are members of the public here to speak on Q or just on item P, on the alcohol tax?
Speak to P.
Forget it. Okay, we'll go in the original order. If you'd withdraw that, Mr. Vice Chair, sorry.
Sure, I withdraw that motion.
So next up on our agenda is item 14P, ordinance number AO 2018-104. As I said, we've read it. We've had public testimony. We're now under debate. Mr. Trainee, are you in the queue to be in debate under?
No, I'll be in debate, but in a while.
We need a motion.
Maybe other amendments. Mine is on the main motion after the amendments are
I
done.
think when we were there, we had a motion to approve the original
I
version.
made the motion.
And that's where we sat, I believe. Who seconded?
I believe I was the second.
Yeah.
Madam Clerk, you've got Mr. Trainee as moving and Mr. Rivera as second. Now it has been moved and seconded, and we are under debate.
Sir.
Yes, I'm here, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Constant is here. Mr. Dyson will be when we call. Anyone wish to debate or propose an amendment on ordinance number 218-104? Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move LaFrance Amendment Number 1.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Weddleton seconds. Ms. LaFrance moved, and Mr. Weddleton seconded. Is there discussion? Well, Ms. LaFrance, do you want to describe it to us briefly?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've received a lot of feedback on this proposed ordinance, and there are two areas of concern, especially to constituents in District 6, and one of them concerns the issue of the charter requirement of 60% of qualified voters on the question. And the language in front of us on the proposed ordinance includes 50 plus 1. And I believe that the public perception is strong that, we are trying to get around the charter by using this lower threshold. So it's my intent here to reintroduce that language, that 60% language in the charter.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Trainee.
Think I'm opposed to this amendment. I talked to Dennis Ritter. I think you remember him. He was the city attorney under Dan Sullivan. He said that the 50% rule is absolutely a valid way to go on this. And then I asked Mr. Falsey, maybe when he became city manager under this current mayor, if he agreed. And rather than speak for Mr. Falsey, he's not city attorney now, but if you can remember back to those days, I asked you this question. Your response was, this was a perfectly fine way to go, because we're asking the voters, as part of this question, to approve it at 50% level. Is that still correct, Mr. Falsey?
Through the chair, it is that the Alaska State Constitution says that a majority has the right to amend its home rule charters, and there is no action that a past majority could have taken to require a supermajority requirement to thwart the will of the current majority. The state constitutional law power is that a majority gets to pick its home rule charter.
Mr. Chairman, so we had from both the conservative mayor's attorney and the current mayor's attorney, they both are consistent with that 50% meets the requirements of the law, 50% plus one vote. So I'm not in favor of amending this, sir, at all.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. With just a little bit more background, I agree with Mr. Trainee that the case specifically was Bruce versus Municipality of Anchorage. Thank you, Ms. Wynn Pearson, for this research today. The Bruce Court looked at the Constitution, states that all charters or parts amendments to charters shall be submitted to the qualified voters of the borough or city and shall become effective if approved by a majority. So it goes on that while the previous charter stated a 3/5 requirement, you cannot hamstring a future majority from making a policy decision. And so the law is firmly in the hands of the people today, and I think it would be quite a horrible precedent to contemplate that we today, from our biases and perspectives, could lock the future up for people who aren't even here yet and have to deal with the world as they face it then. And so I'm not in support of this amendment. Thank you.
Ms. Wynn Pearson, did you want in earlier or in the due course?
If I might just add my voice to my two predecessors on the same legal issue, I think that, as has already been stated, the language of the Constitution is clear that a change to the charter, which goes to the voters, shall become effective at a 50% plus one vote. That's the language of the Constitution. And I think the challenge is that we do have a couple provisions in our charter that purport to play with that and say, no, supermajority is required here and here and here. And I think the quandary I see with this amendment is you're effectively creating a workaround of the Constitution in the name of some provisions of the Charter, which, again, one of which a court has explicitly held violate the Constitution. So I think it's key to go back to that language of the Constitution, Article 10, Section 9, that says that any change to a charter shall become effective, that the right of the people is always to amend their charter by a majority vote. And so that's the question you're sending to the voters here, is whether they want to amend their charter, which, again, explicitly legal under the Constitution.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Actually, Ms. Wint Pearson very eloquently answered what I was going to ask. Thank you.
Mr. Weddleton?
Well, I think there's in many cases, just because something's legal doesn't mean it's right. And, in this case, I accept the legal opinion that it takes a majority vote to change a charter, and actually that sounds reasonable. But there is also a very reasonable expectation, clearly stated through our charter, that people expect 60% vote before we do a sales tax. And we should honor that. That's what people wanted. We can do it the legal way and say 50% to change the charter, but 60% for us to impose that tax. And I think that's what this attempts to do. That meets the city's expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. The clerk has reminded me there's as in all matters, there's a 1 hour time limit, which she started when we, on debate, which she started when we started debating it. So that is rolling. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think in this case, a majority, 50% plus one, is both legal and right. We have a very recent precedent. We asked something very similar for the MLMP sale, and there were some of the same concerns raised, and the people of Anchorage saw that before them and decided to vote the way they did. And in this case specifically, they have a chance to reject it, right? So if they think you're doing something that we don't feel we're comfortable with, then they can vote against it. I don't see why we need to have a majority of people's desires squandered or prevented, rather, by this prior majority. So I think it's both legal and right to put the question to the people, and if they feel it is illegitimate, then that's fine. But I think we're being very transparent about it. We're saying we are asking you to amend the charter. Please do so or don't do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Mr. Weddleton that it's a reasonable expectation that the language in this proposed ordinance would reflect the language of the charter. And I guess I'm just a little bit confused, since this is the second time, and I've been here, that we've taken this approach. Why don't we address the issue of the language in the charter, or after the Bruce case? I'm surprised that that we weren't required to do that. Would you be able to address that, Ms. Wynn Pearson?
Through the chair, certainly. I think the challenge is purely administrative. We could at any time send a question to the challenges are charter mechanism and the state constitution require that charter changes go to the voters to be accomplished. And so we need to send a vote to the people to correct the charter, and I think that just simply hasn't happened, to remove some of those supermajority requirements, specifically Section 1801, which was the subject of the Bruce decision.
Did you have any more? No. Mr. Constant?
Thanks. Just briefly, another good example of the problem Ms. LaFrance just raised is the state constitution and its ban against marriage for same-sex couples. And the fact is, why don't we just change the state constitution? Well, it takes a lot of work and a vote of the people, and can we achieve that with the people that we have today? And so it's kind of a scary question when you contemplate the tyranny of the majority, and I just want to put that out there.
Any other debate on amendment number 1, LaFrance amendment number 1? Not seeing any. Are you ready for the question? Members will vote on amendment number 1.
Mr. Chair, I'm present.
Yeah, and I did recognize you, but you certainly are.
The system recognizes me as absent. I'm a no, thank you.
Sorry about that, Mr. Constant. We'll get it fixed. So Mr. Constant is a no.
Is Mr. Dyson on the line?
No. So that fails 2-8. And what do we have to do to get him online? You're going to... Okay. She'll work on fixing it, Mr. Constant, so you're shown as here. Are there any other amendments?
Oops.
Are there any other amendments or motion? Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move LaFrance Amendment 2. I think that's the number.
Second.
It's been moved by Ms. LaFrance, seconded by Mr. Weddleton. Ms. LaFrance, under discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the second area of concern that I've heard primarily from constituents concerns the dedicating of funds and particularly the category of public safety. And the specific concern is that while this particular administration and assembly is committed to addressing issues related to substance abuse, misuse, prevention, treatment, behavioral health, and homelessness, there's no guarantee that that will be the case with future administrations and assemblies. And particularly, again, in the category of public safety, there could be a scenario in which an administration wanted to use these funds to fund general operational government costs under the cap and not use the revenue for the stated intent. And that is a tremendous concern, I think, to many citizens who've contacted us. And so the point of this amendment here is to limit public safety appropriations to those that are directly related and reasonably necessary to support the services and facilities that are described or programs. And then after those projects and programs are funded and we get to functional zero and homelessness and a place where, we don't need perhaps the entirety of the revenue, then it may be appropriated to public safety operating costs within the cap.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to thank Ms. LaFrance for bringing this forward, but I think I will be voting against this, mainly because I think simplicity, particularly when we're sending this to the voters, is going to be critical. And I want to hear from the administration on two things, if I could. First, when it comes to the current language in the proposal versus the amendment, is this really allowing different things to happen, or are we really talking about the same thing? And then second is from finance, sort of the protections on the fund allocation. I think that's a pretty critical part as well. So if we can hear from the administration on those two.
Through the chair, I guess I can begin, and maybe I'll seek some assistance on this. I think there's a way of reading this on first blush where it doesn't seem like it's making a tremendous substantive difference, that the uses remain the same, but you must show that you have boiled off certain purposes before you can touch the other purposes. That said, I think a closer read makes this a troubling amendment for us, especially where you can only use the public safety portion, you can only direct some of this stream to public safety purposes once you've demonstrated that the other uses have been adequately funded. There are no other provisions of the charter that require any particular service to be funded. I'm afraid that this is going to be an invitation to litigation, that if the Assembly elects to appropriate money to homelessness prevention, abatement of campsites, treatment centers, and then says some of this is going to go to a mobile intervention team for the fire department, there are going to be some community members who say, wait, I'm suing you. You have appropriated money to a public safety purpose without actually adequately funding the level of homelessness response that I'm interested in seeing. And I think that it's going to put us in a somewhat untenable position.
Through the chair, if I might second that from a legal perspective, that I think that the challenge is that adequate funding is not a defined concept, and so it simply invites argument when it's a criteria for being able to use the funding. And I think it would, again, it opens the door to potential legal disputes down the way for any kind of choice in this area, because there's both the dedication terms are there's some question about interpretation. What is a public safety cost directly related versus what is a public safety cost that is not directly related, and then what is adequate funding both are somewhat open questions that would be, I think, as Mr. Falsey correctly notes, would be invitations to argument down the road.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera, and thank you to the administration. Mr. Constant.
Mr. Rivera asked my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Yeah, but I think Mr. Falsey's point actually speaks to why this amendment is necessary when he says, some of this money would likely use for the mobile intervention team. And that's probably what we don't want to do. What we want to do, if we're going to impose this tax on the industry and on the drinkers of the city, that we want to up our game. So we want to go above and beyond what we've been doing. So if we've been paying for the mobile intervention team out of normal operating funds, keep it there, and this money will go to increase our presence. If it's just going to cover stuff that we've already been doing, I don't think that's what we get buy-in on this. So I do support this. I think this is much more gentle than the simple remedy to just delete for public safety and leave it strictly focused on dealing with homelessness. I don't find this confusing either. I think having the barn door open by just saying public safety as it is now is simply too risky. Thank you.
Ms. LaFrance, I have Mr. Falsey in, I think, to respond to that. Can I duck him? Mr. Falsey.
Yes, thank you, the Chair. I know there's going to be an appropriate time somewhere down the road to actually debate how the funds could be used, so I don't want to take us too far down that rabbit hole. But I did want to clarify, it was not the administration's intent to propose just taking this money and substituting for things that we were already funding. The mobile intervention team is one idea, but it wouldn't be to pay for it in the form that it is now. It would be to supercharge it. Right now, we've had folks in the budget process last time that said it should be 24/7, and it should really mature into a core crisis team so that you can go to people who are in substance use crisis, catch them early before they're becoming frequent 911 type users. Our concern is that this kind of language is going to make it really hard to ever cleanly and in a way that doesn't risk litigation get to the public safety uses that are related without incurring a fight about, nope, before you spent any one of those dollars, you really should have been abating more campsites. And I think that hobbles the intent of the original proposal in a way that seems problematic to us.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I understand that if this were to pass, there would be a subsequent ordinance in which we would be able to provide specifics and further direction as to how the money could be appropriated. However, I do believe that many of the folks who told me that they are generally in support of not just sending this to the voters, but actually of a retail tax, have said that this part really makes them uncomfortable. And the fact that it's easy to change an ordinance compared to, as we've talked about with the last amendment, the charter. Would you be able to suggest any language that might assure people that that the money will not just be, spent on, of course, very important services, but services, still within the general operations budget, that alternate language that would not be an invitation to litigation and that would not reduce any kind of efficacy in terms of the involvement of public safety in addressing these issues?
So through the chair, my acute response is our best attempt was the language that we put in front of you, that we hope that this is a language that when we're doing the public campaign from January to April, we can explain to voters this is a guarantee that there will be a revenue stream that exists for these purposes. Now, we're not forever tying our hands if we ever reach Valhalla and there is no longer a need for camp cleanup because there are no camps and we have solved the substance abuse crisis and there is no longer a need for that the flows can fund wherever they're necessary. And the check that the people will always have is that they elect you, and you guys are always annually making the decisions about where this money can go. So I think we've given it our best college try. I don't know if it's perfect. Probably everything can be improved, but I don't know that I have a better answer for you now.
Thank you. And then Ms. Wint Pearson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know that I have anything better to offer by way of language than I sort of have, of the same mind as Mr. Falsey. We went round and round with this language, and I think we came with what we thought was the best summary that was both specific and yet holistic enough to reflect the various items that are needed to enhance the response to the problems we're seeing right now. I did want to call your attention to one big picture construction issue, which I hope might help to allay some concerns about a number of the nuances of this tax, which is the distinction between how this charter change is phrased versus some of the other specific taxes that are in the charter. If you notice specifically the bed tax, when it was adopted, that charter language says the tax is hereby levied. So the charter change made the tax a necessity. It made the tax automatically implemented. In contrast, the ballot proposition that you're looking at right now, as currently phrased, states that the Assembly is authorized to levy a tax. So the tax does not exist until this body, the power to tax would exist if this were passed by the voters, but there is a necessary secondary hurdle that has to be overcome before there is any tax in this instance, which is the enabling ordinance by this body that sets out the contours of this tax, including exemptions, including potential rebates, including further dedication language within the language that's set by the actual charter language. So to the extent that that's helpful, I just wanted to make that point that this is a different change than other bodies have looked to adopt in the charter in the past, and a necessary next step is an ordinance where many of these finer point details can and should be addressed.
Thank you, Ms. Wint Pearson. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. So that raises an interesting question. Would a future 6-member majority be able to reduce the levy to 0?
Through the chair, yes, I think they could. The way it's crafted right now, they are authorized to levy a 5% tax, and so there's no opportunity to levy a tax of a different amount. But I think that a future assembly could elect to no longer levy the tax if it were no longer necessary.
Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One other suggestion that was made by a member of the community was to include an authority comprised of or with members suggested by the administration, the assembly, and other community members at large. And I've been told that something like that would not be introduced at the charter level, but actually would also be at the ordinance level. Is that your opinion as well?
Through the chair, I certainly think that would be appropriate. If you look at if you look at the just standard legal breakdown between our charter and our code, we create boards and commissions, advisory citizen bodies through the code based on the powers set forth in the charter. So here, I think you could very easily create a combined elected and civilian commission to advise on the uses of the tax revenue if that's what your desire was through the enabling ordinance.
And just to follow up real quick.
Absolutely. Ms. LaFrance.
Is that something that we couldn't put in the charter, or we just wouldn't want to because, again, if down the road we wanted to make that change, it would be very difficult given how hard it is to change the charter?
Through the chair, I think it's the latter. There's no restriction on what you could put in the charter per se, but I think we've generally used the rule of thumb of trying to put things, enabling powers in the charter, and then allowing for changes that might alter over time, or we might want to tweak it, see how it works, and then decide if we want to change the composition or something like that through an ordinance, which is easier to adopt over time.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, what if we eliminated the word adequately from this amendment? What do you feel about that idea?
Through the chair, I'm not sure that helps the legal quandary of trying to figure out if we've met that standard. The point that Mr. Falsey and I commented on previously, if it just says their programs are funded in the proposed annual budget, does that mean fully funded? Funded to whose standard? I'm not sure what that means either.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Wint Pearson. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to oppose this amendment, even though I respect Ms. LaFrance's attempts here, and I see what she's driving at, but I think there's there's a policy question and there's a political question. I should say, first of all, that I agree with Mr. Rivera that whatever we can do to keep the language as simple as possible, as clear as possible, I am going to support that. And so I think that's going to cause me to vote against most of the amendments that are proposed, unless I see some real compelling interest. But here, I think, again, there's a policy question and a political question. The policy question is it possible these funds could be, quote unquote, wasted on something other than what we intend to? Like, we want to use it for behavioral health. We want to use it for prevention and substance abuse. Well, we know that there is a huge need for those, far beyond actually whatever. We could raise $15 million here and make a real dent in it, but I doubt we're going to get to a point where we can cover all the behavioral health or substance abuse challenges in Anchorage. So that's the policy question I'm not so troubled by, because I think we will spend it on this thing that we all really, really value, and what we're saying we're going to spend it on. The other question is a political question, which I think is the more valid concern, which is, will people see the word public safety, and are there a certain number of people who are going to vote against this that would have voted for it but for that word being in there, or those words being in there? And I don't think that's going to happen. And the reason I don't think that's going to happen is because I had a chance to go door knocking this summer and in the fall. And, door knocking, you're just seeing one segment of the community, but you talk to hundreds of people, so it becomes almost like a survey. And basically every person I talked to, their number one concern was public safety. And so insofar as some funds might leak out into the police department, which I don't think is going to happen. I don't think that there's a large political risk that there are people who would have voted for this that are not going to. At least the people that I spoke to, the hundreds that knocked on hundreds of doors and spoke to, some dozens of people. So because of that, I'm going to oppose this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. Just for clarity, the idea isn't that funds would, just to quote you, leak out into public safety. The idea for me is that public safety is well funded. In fact, it's the number one most funded department in our municipality. Some say it's not the number one. I think it's.
Well, if you add fire, it's 40-something%.
Yeah, if you include fire, but just the police department, and I am pro-police and I want to support them, but I want to ensure that these funds are funding opportunities outside of what we know are easy, if you will, to fund, and things at this time that are public safety related are quite easy to fund. And so I think that's at the heart of the question here. So it's not so much we're afraid they might bleed into public safety funding, but that let's fund the things that we can't find funding for and not fund the things that the voters will almost always support, or at least in my experience have almost always supported. And so that's the differential here, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. So still on LaFrance Amendment number 2, is there any other discussion? I'm not seeing any. Are you prepared to vote on Amendment number 2? Members may proceed to vote on Amendment number 2. Do we have you in, Mr. Constant? You in? That motion fails 2-8. Are there further amendments? Any further amendments? I don't intend to offer at least amendment number 4, which would have increased it to an 8% tax, with 3 going to property tax relief, or given the authority to do that. Yeah. If there's no other amendments, then we'll be heading to a vote on the underlying bill. Well, people got to move them. So, yes, Ms. LaFrance?
That was my question as well. I think that Ms. Quinn Davidson wanted to ask, we have a couple more amendments and that folks are not planning to move. Is that correct?
Just because, because they're in the folder, I mean, it doesn't mean anything. Does anybody want to move an amendment?
Yeah, I want to move constant amendment number 5.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion on constant amendment number 5? Ms. LaFrance, do you want to describe it?
Well, and I understand that, again, if this were to pass, this being at the ballot, the alcohol tax, that the ordinance that would follow would address a number of these issues. This amendment, for those who don't have a copy, says the Assembly shall provide for an allowance that registered retailers in good standing may deduct and retain from the tax monies collected by their business to offset their costs of collecting and timely remitting the taxes authorized by this section. This sounds like a reasonable idea to me.
Mr. Constant, was yours, do you want the administration or would you like to respond?
Is Ms. Cruz here? So I would like Ms. Cruz to come and talk about the impact of this.
Ms. Cruz, welcome.
Thank you.
Just give your name for the record.
Bliss Cruz. So you just want me to talk in general, or do you have a specific question? Or
How about give your perspective on this amendment?
Thank you. So through the chair, my perspective as the manager of the tax enforcement for in Treasury is that we have 5 other tax codes that do not allow for an administrative credit. So none of our room tax operators, none of our rental vehicle agencies, tobacco distributors, fuel dealers, or marijuana retailers are able to offset any of their administrative costs through a code authorized credit. So there's been some comparison of the alcohol tax to the marijuana tax. I think this question might have been discussed when the marijuana tax ordinance was going through the public process. The decision was made to not allow retailers to receive an administrative credit for complying with the code. If the alcohol tax code passes and there is an administrative credit to alcohol retailers, there would be a disparity between the tax codes. And it could potentially cause a snowball effect because we have a lot of crossover taxpayers. We have some that pay room tax. They also have a bar. They might sell cigarettes. So if there's a credit given for one type of tax for compliance, but there's none for the other types of taxes, there could potentially be a lobby to try to get a credit in the other tax codes, and that will have a negative revenue effect overall.
Do you want to follow up?
Just a quick one. Can you give a sense of scale for the potential of that?
Yes, so through the chair, we did some calculations today, and based off of estimated annual revenues in 2020, if there was, for every 1% of an administrative credit for program taxes, which are the ones that I just described, as well as if the alcohol tax passes, it would be about $1 million of negative revenue for every 1% of an administrative credit across all of the program taxes. So if it was just for the alcohol tax, the estimated revenue is that I have here on my paper is $13 million. So that would be about $132,000 for if it was just alcohol.
Does that do it, Mr. Constant? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't have any questions, so I don't know if anyone else has questions.
Any other questions?
I
Yes.
kind of wanted to ask the same sort of thing. We got a lot of requests from people and understanding the tough economic times and that a lot of this impacts our small businesses. I think I like what Mr. Constant was trying to do, and I'm glad Suzanne moved it. But I now understand that it would probably create more problems than it would solve. So
possibly.
Anyway, I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate the intent on this body because I think we really are trying to hear from people who are writing into it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Do you want to be back in the queue, or that's what you wanted to say? Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking to the amendment, I I appreciate the intent of this, but I'm not sure that this is the right time during this process to actually handle this. This is something that would go into our charter, and maybe legal can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anything else like this exists in our charter. And so I would suggest that we vote no on this amendment, and if we want to do something like this, that if the voters approve it at the ballot box, then we have the opportunity to have that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. Mr. Weddleton.
Well, I hope you will all turn around and vote yes on this. Because I question those calculations. This doesn't say how much that, allowance would be for retailers who pay this. And more simply, it could be something like you pay on time, you get $50 off. Cover your cost. It's not that hard really to collect this. You run a report in your point of sale, but it takes a little time. You get paid more time, and that wouldn't be anywhere near $100,000 a year or more. It'd be simple to calculate, much lower. So this opens the door, and just because the other taxes don't have this very reasonable and fair provision doesn't mean it's wrong here.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Trainee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be opposed to this, because quite frankly, we need to handle this at a later time for all the other tax entities, other areas we tax. I don't want one group to have disparity with the other ones. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There'll be no vote.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So when I crafted this, I definitely believed and still believe that we should create a reasonable policy by which the cost can be covered by the tax itself so that we aren't unduly burdening people. However, the notion of having only one industry, and not only having one industry, but having one industry protected in the charter struck me as not a good policy decision. And I don't think we should be building discount codes into our charter. And so I think we need to do that with the code.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Anybody else on Constant Amendment number 5? Moved by Ms. LaFrance and seconded by Mr. Peterson. If there's no further discussion, members may proceed to vote on Amendment number 5. That amendment fails 2-8. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move Croft Amendment number 6.
That's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, and this amendment states that at least 120 days, or may I, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely, Ms. LaFrance.
At least 120 days before the end of the fiscal year of the municipality and at such other times as the Assembly directs, the mayor shall submit to the Assembly a report of the tax revenues collected and expended. The report of expenses shall be itemized, be each authorized use or purpose. I think that, there's a typo. For each authorized use or by each. And again, I understand that if this would go to the voters and the voters would approve this tax, there would be an ordinance in which we could specify these sorts of things. However, we do not have any sales taxes outside the cap right now, and so it makes sense to me that we would put this in our charter. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Croft?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman. Just getting used to this trade-off. Yeah, so what I intended, and I think what it does by this amendment is just pull over that section from Mr. Weddleton's S version. So, and it looks to be identical. It was D on the S version, it's E here, but it's that reporting. And the criticism I've heard of it is that it may not be necessary, but I think there is this sense of we want the public to understand that we're going to treat this in a different way. We're going to specially account for it. And I've heard administration officials say, well, you can always ask for that. You can ask for that any time through audit or just separating it out in the budget. And I think that's true, but this is a new thing that we're going to treat in different ways, and we ought to draw a fence around it, and we can, but this tells us to. And whether it's somewhat superfluous, I think it's appropriate. Thank you for offering it.
Thank you, Mr. Croft.
Thank you, and I have Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Oh, I just wanted to ask a question, either for members of this body, but probably more for the administration. Are there other reports that you submit like this, and if so, what? And my guess is that none of that requirement is not often found in the charter, that it's probably more likely a code requirement. Thank you.
Through the chair, we can hunt and peck. My recollection is that the only real reports that are required by the charter are the actual budget process. I don't think there's anything in the charter that requires us to send anything that would be directly analogous to this kind of report to the body. And of course, you approved the budget, so you would be setting what the expenditures can be in the fall or December, and so you would know what path we're on. And we already now give a quarterly revenue report, so you'd be seeing the revenues in real time. I think that I understand the intent of the amendment, and I think that it's a well-intentioned amendment, but I would say I think it is superfluous and certainly something could be handled on the back end. It does add length and complexity to an already pretty long ballot proposition.
Anything more, Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Sure, just thanks for that explanation, and I'll be voting no just because it sounds like it's a bit redundant, and I agree that it's best to keep the language simple. Thank you.
Thank you, and next, Mr. Trainee.
Mr. Croft, could we add alcohol before the word tax? I want to specify which tax we're talking about. I know it's in this, but I want to be specific because people tend to forget over time. I'd like an amendment that adds the word alcohol into that so we know specifically we're going to have this report once a year coming to us. We'll deal with alcohol tax collected and how it's spent, sir. That's an amendment I want to bring forward to this.
Okay, so now
I'd like to support it. I just want that word in there.
The amendment to the amendment is to add the word alcohol before tax, so that's on line 3 of the text of E. Does the administration have any response on that?
Through the chair, I'm not sure I have a substantive response other than to say that if you read the addition of subsection E in context, it will be plainly clear that the only tax that that subsection is referring to is the alcohol beverage retail sales tax. I think you're hearing from us that we generally prefer an economy of words to keep the ballot proposition smaller, but I don't think I can provide you a substantive objection beyond that.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey and Mr. Trainee. So that has been moved. Has it been seconded as an amendment?
I'll go ahead and second it.
Moved by Mr. Trainee, seconded by Mr. Rivera. Amendment to the amendment number 6. Amendment to Croft Amendment number 6. Is there an objection to that amendment to the amendment? Seeing no objection, amendment number 6 has been amended to add alcohol before the word tax. With the amended Croft Amendment number 6, is there further discussion? Mr. Constant.
Thank you. I think that this too falls into the area of what we can address by ordinance and should, not in the charter. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we do regularly get in our packets reports of the bar safety hour situation, and so we could get a similar report on the expenses from the alcohol tax. And we can decide that, without having to put it in the charter. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Trainee again.
It's always good for this body to have more information coming on a regular basis because from time to time the body changes. People forget things we've asked over the past. I want to have this in there because I want to know how the money is being collected and spent. We owe that to the public to have accountability on how the money is being spent. And regardless of how the assembly makeup changes, I want this to be in there. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other discussion of the amended amendment number 6, Croft Amendment number 6 as amended? Seeing no more discussion, members may proceed to vote. That amendment fails 5-5.
It's a 5-5, huh?
Right, 5-5.
Because we don't have Fred with us.
Took us all a second to calculate up to 10. Any other amendments to be proposed? I'll give members a second because we did have a number of others. So there's, I don't intend to offer Croft number 4. Mr. Weddleton, you're not proposing Weddleton number 1? Oh, it's to the S version, I see. So I don't see any other amendments. Would any member like to propose any amendments? And seeing none, back in debate. Any member on debate on the underlying bill? We have 15 minutes, just under 15 minutes on our clock. But Mr. Weddleton.
Oh, I should be finished well under 15.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton.
Yeah, I just want to say we've heard a lot on this, and the industry has told us that this is not fair, and I agree with them. It's not fair to tax one industry for problems that are a society problem. It's not all these problems are alcohol problems, but there's a lot of things that are unfair. It's unfair that the state has neglected its role in helping the mentally ill and the addicted. It's unfair that we are, as a city, faced with paying for roofs over the head of people who aren't making their own way. But we aren't going to pay. We're either going to pay by putting them in prison, or we're going to pay by putting them somewhere in recovery where they may have some hope of developing an independent life. It's not fair that neighborhoods near our green belts are under an onslaught of crime because of the homelessness. So there's plenty of unfairness to go around. But we need to fix this problem. We need to fix the homelessness. We need to fix the root causes. It has to be done. We have no choice. So it would be more fair to do this with a broad-based sales tax. But that's not what's in front of us now. By the course of our business, what's in front of us now is an alcohol tax. And I recommend, unfortunately, that we do this. But not this one. There's a superior version that is less unfair, and that's the S version. So I recommend that you vote this one down, and then we consider the S version, which is a much preferred version.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Trainee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's time for us to send this to the voters. We know what the problem is. Do you remember the meetings we had earlier today? We talked about the tobacco tax. When we brought that forward, we were told people won't buy tobacco in Anchorage, they'll go to the valley. What did you hear we're getting for that a year? $20 million a year coming in. We heard the same thing about a year ago. We dealt with the motor fuel tax. We're going to buy our fuel somewhere else. There'll be no money coming into Anchorage. We get, I think, $11 million on that. We've heard the argument on this now. If you do this, we'll buy our alcohol somewhere else. It'll hurt the business. It won't hurt the businesses. This is something they will pass on to the consumers. The state should be doing this, but the state's backed away from their responsibility, dealing with the effect of alcohol on Anchorage. You saw the administration where they brought the numbers to us on the amount and the cost of alcohol in Anchorage. The cost is tremendous. It's being borne by the citizens right now in their taxation. It should be borne by the users of this product. And we take a look at marijuana. Remember when we passed marijuana? They pay 5%. And so how much does alcohol pay? Nothing. On the state level, marijuana is taxed. On the city level, they pay a portion of the tax. But alcohol pays on the state level, but nothing on the state level. This allows us to go to voters, and we're asking the voters to approve this. And all we're doing today is sending it to voters. We're not saying there'll be a 5% tax on alcohol. All we're doing is sending the voters. So what's the problem with asking the electorate of Anchorage if they think this is a good idea? If they do, they'll approve it. If they don't, they'll tell us to go pack it. Don't bring it back again for a while. But this is something this town needs. I take a look at the homeless we've got out there. You look at the people on the street, the increase in crime. 90% of all crime in Anchorage is related to alcohol, one variation or another. Not only here, but on the state level. When you talk to prosecutors, you drill down to what caused the problem. Alcohol-driven. We need to address this issue. This gives us a chance to send the electorate, and let's see what they tell us. Mr. Chairman, I'll be voting yes on this.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's been said many, many times in the past that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so, we've been waiting for the state to share their alcohol tax that they've collected for the last 15, 16 years. And so far, it hasn't happened, and the prospects for it happening sometime in the future are very, very slim. And like Mr. Trainey said, 90% of the calls that APD goes on are alcohol-related. I've done ride-alongs, and the time that I was out there for about 10 hours one night, every single call was alcohol-related but one. And so, and I've had people in my district saying, you need to solve this homeless problem. It's out of control. But the problem is we don't have the resources. And so by taxing alcohol, we will obtain the resources, and I see it as a user fee. So I'll be voting yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, and we have Mr. Dyson on the line. Are you there, Mr. Dyson?
Are you there, Mr. Dyson?
I am.
Thank you, sir. I know you're suffering through a medical condition, but we appreciate it. We're in debate on the underlying bill. Mr. Rivera.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So 2 points I want to raise. First is about process, and I think Ms. Wint-Pearson did a good job laying it out earlier, but I just want to repeat for the benefit of the public that all we're doing today is saying we want the voters to weigh in on this potential alcohol tax. And if the voters come back to us and say 50% plus one of them say, yes, this is something that we're interested in, then this gets taken back to us. And at that point, I absolutely invite the alcohol industry to come to us and say, okay, we see this is going to happen, and work with us on the framework for this. So that's the first point I want to raise. Second is, I agree, Mr. Weddleton. This isn't fair. That we have to face a $1.8 billion net cost because of alcohol misuse. That isn't fair at all. Something else that isn't fair is that we have people dying on our streets. Literally, we heard it, dying on our streets. I think it's incumbent upon us to send this to the voters because no one, the alcohol industry, no industry can no longer hold their hands up and say, not my problem. Neighborhoods have become de facto experts on homelessness because it is their problem. It's in their neighborhoods. They've even come and presented to my committee a 12-point plan and other ideas. I asked for that same communication from the alcohol industry a year ago when we had the same question before us. And what I got wasn't anywhere near commensurate to what the community did when they stepped up. I do want to respect that we did have some folks step up. ARBRA stepped up and they sent representatives. But now I think it's time that we find some funding to really seriously deal with this issue. And I think this is the right path for us to go. So I will be voting yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Rivera. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's no question we have serious problems to address in our community, and there's no question we have fewer resources to do that. I am very concerned of the impact on the small local businesses in particular, and we have many very responsible and active and engaged businesses in our community who are working to address these issues. I don't understand some of them who've said they would absorb the cost and not pass that on to the user. I very much enjoy a good microbrew or wine or whatever, and would not find that prohibitive, though I understand that people have different circumstances. The overwhelming message that I have received from constituents is that they want to vote on this and that we should send this to the voters and trust the voters to make the decision on it. As I spoke before, there are two areas of concern regarding, one, dedicating the funds, and also the 50 or the simple majority required. But again, if the voters don't approve of this and think that it's circumventing the charter or not enough assurance that the funds, the revenue would be spent appropriately, then I trust that the voters will reject this. So I will support this and agree that it's appropriate to send this to the voters and let the citizens of Anchorage decide.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move to extend debate on this item for 10 minutes.
We've got 5 minutes left. Any objection to extending debate for 10 minutes? Without objection, then we'll extend for another 10 minutes. Yeah, Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So a year ago, this question was before us, and I'll start off by saying I declared a conflict last year, and this year I went and sat with the ethics board and had a nice conversation about the nature of conflicts in this issue, because I serve in my professional capacity, one of my professional capacities as a fundraiser for a treatment provider of drug and alcohol treatment. And the discussion and the kind of decision that came from that discussion was that the benefits are too attenuated to create a conflict. And so I am not conflicted out of this, in my opinion. If anyone disagrees, let me know. Last year also, when this question came up, there was a really disproportionate and, to me, wildly aggressive campaign against the Assembly making a vote on this issue. And it was in the radio and on the media, and it just immediately made me regret receiving an endorsement from one of the alcohol lobbies. And I learned I won't make that mistake again. And so this is not a tax on the alcohol industry. This is a tax on me if the voters should approve this. This is a tax on every bottle of wine in my wine collection, every bottle of bourbon in my bourbon collection, and I'm willing to pay that tax. Not because I believe it's a sin tax. I actually believe that I have a right to drink and should be able to peacefully enjoy a beverage in my home or at a local bar, which is probably going to be a little more hostile for me when I go there in the near term. I believe that some exemptions and some costs should be allowed. In fact, probably should be allowed across all of our taxees, I guess, for the lack of a better word, payees of tax. But I think that we need to tackle that through ordinance and not through the charter, because the charter should be as clean as possible. So I have, like Mr. Rivera, heard probably more than Mr. Rivera, even for years, from my neighbors demanding some kind of different policies and mechanisms for dealing with the problems that we face. Many of them related to the consumption of alcohols, especially in our public places. I have heard the demand, and I agree, we need to fund camp abatement as long through the year as we can. And we're already dealing with hundreds of thousands of tons of property that we're taking out of the encampments. I also believe that the mobile intervention team needs to be 7 days a week, because that's the actual leading edge of where change is happening in our community, where we're connecting the people living in crisis with the resources and the opportunities that are available. And I heard many people speak to this from the industry saying, you should go to Juneau, they're already taking our money. And I laugh because about 5 years ago, I went to Juneau and I fought and I asked for your help, and I didn't get your help. But there were 2 small restaurateurs that went with me, and together we raised $4 million that this community did spend getting people off the street. But we didn't hear from you. So that, to me, is a false argument. Why don't you go to Juneau and tell them to spend that $20 million they promised here? Because I have, and I continue to do that. So my message to the voters of Anchorage is, you've been asking for help cleaning up the encampments and fixing some of these ongoing problems. I'm going to vote to send $1 branch of that solution to you tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Borowski.
It's Borowski, and
I just checked. You keep changing it on me. All right, whatever you're called, you're recognized.
and I think the biggest thing in here is the word prevention. If we prevent something before it even begins, we will be able to have a lesser problem in the future. We may be able to prevent homelessness in the future. We may be able to prevent more government funds going to rehab. I support this because of the word prevention. The Youth Advisory Commission discussed how these funds should be spent, and we talked about getting more people into schools talking about alcoholism, opening this conversation. And that's the biggest thing, is opening a conversation on how to prevent alcoholism, how to prevent more people getting addicted to this very legal drug. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Borowski. Mr. Weddleton.
Colleagues, you have all spoken extremely well on the issues here, the opportunities, and I urge you to vote no on this one so we can put forward to the voters the superior substitute version.
Thank you. I believe you mentioned that, but good. Thank you, Mr. Whittleton. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
I'll just be brief because, as Mr. Weddleton said, my colleagues have really articulated this issue well. But I just want to say that, you know, we've received a lot of emails. We've talked with a lot of people. The overwhelming majority of people in my district have asked me to vote yes tonight, and that's what I'm planning to do. I think the claims that this is unfair are just not true. There are taxes on many other industries. You have to pay a 12% tax to stay in a hotel. If tourists are doing that, and we know the prices of hotels here in the summer, I really think people are still going to buy a drink, me included, and I, like Mr. Constant, really enjoy bourbon. We have this tax in other communities. It's not uncommon. It's working in Alaska, and I'll be voting yes because I believe it's in the public's arena to make this decision.
Thank you, Ms. Quinn Davidson. Mr. Dyson, did you want to speak?
Mr. Dyson, would you like to speak?
No.
Okay. Are there any other, anyone else who would like to speak on this bill? I'm not seeing anyone. Are you ready for the vote? Madam Clerk, will take the roll. Senator Dyson?
Yes.
Senator Dyson votes yes. That measure passes 10-1.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I move the immediate reconsideration and urge a no vote.
Second.
The reconsideration has been moved and seconded. Did you catch the second, Madam Clerk? No vote finalizes this matter. Yes brings it up for reconsideration. Members may proceed to vote on the reconsideration motion.
How do you vote, Mr. Dyson?
Yes.
To reconsider. Correct your error.
And Mr. Dyson, I know you're in some pain. That's the main matter. The matter we have next is the bar hours extension. We're going to have public testimony and then postpone that till sometime in January or February.
All right. Have a good night and Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is item 14Q. Ordinance number AO 2018-113, an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code Section 1050-010 to change the permitted times for sale and consumption of alcohol on premises with a liquor license by Assembly Member Croft and Dunbar. Public testimony is now open on this item. Does anyone wish to testify on ordinance number 2018-113? Anyone at all? Welcome.
Good morning, good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the Assembly. My name is Sarah Oates, President and CEO of Alaska Char. Voters in New York and Georgia have passed similar pieces of legislation referred to as brunch bills or mimosa mandates in 2016 and 2018, respectively. There was overwhelming public support for both bills, due primarily to the desire of community members to be able to have a mimosa or Irish coffee with brunch. Like in those communities, there are many residents here in Anchorage who have made similar requests. Sports enthusiasts would appreciate the ability to have a Bloody Mary while watching Sunday morning football or the World Cup, and tourists would appreciate the ability to have a drink while on layover. Additionally, night shift workers would like the ability to enjoy a beer with dinner at the end of their shifts in the early morning, as the rest of us are able. If this passes, I expect that very few bars will exercise this new right, as it would be cost prohibitive. I assume that a number of restaurants who already have the ability to serve food during these hours would extend their alcohol service hours in order to provide a more pleasant experience for customers. It is my expectation that the increase in revenue for locally owned businesses and the improved morning dining experiences for the community would outweigh any potential negative impacts, and I would urge you to vote yes. Thank you.
You said mimosa mandate?
Mimosa mandate.
All right. Any, Mr. Dunbar, sorry.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm not for a question, for a motion in a moment.
Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Oates. Any other public testimony on this item? Any at all?
Okay.
Seeing none, I'll close.
No, Mr. Chair, can I make a motion to continue public hearing rather than close it now?
Second.
You absolutely can make the motion.
I make a motion to continue public hearing until the meeting of February 26th.
Second.
Any objection to that motion? Seeing none, a public hearing is continued till our meeting of February 26th.
Before we do that, when is for Rendezvous this year?
What's that?
When is for Rendezvous this year? Because it might be wise that we aim to do this before for Rendezvous. It's practical. It's a practical matter, which would argue for the meeting on the 12th. But I believe it's that last week of February, right?
Through the chair, I believe it's the 22nd of February through the 3rd of March, 2019.
So we could do it through half of Rendezvous? No. Okay, I withdraw my motion. The second can withdraw his too?
Yep.
All right, I make the motion to continue public hearing until the meeting of February 12th.
Thank you. Second.
Moved and seconded to the 12th. Is there any objection to continuing public hearing until February 12th? I'm not seeing any. If there's no objection, that motion passes. Any other items? I do not believe we have any other items of business. Brings us to Section 17, audience participation. Anyone like to testify on, well, it's participate on something that hasn't been discussed. Mr. Haberman, would you like to speak under audience participation?
Correct.
You may begin.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I represent myself. I live in the mountains in the valley. I follow the public process. The public process done appropriately. Decision made by the governing body is more like in the public interest. My statement tonight is regarding what I witnessed was a adoption of a policy from time to time used. And what I'm concerned is this. You schedule public hearings to invite the public to speak. And on certain times, I witnessed a scenario is that the public hearing before the chair, in respect, not yourself, it happened prior, the previous chair, advised the parties that if you want to testify today at that public hearing, you're not going to be allowed because we're going to have a public hearing later on. So with all due respect, that's a wrong policy. It happened. It happened recently. It happened on the infrastructure. So with regard to that, when you advertise a public hearing, and then you continue public hearing, which you did, and then you tell the public there, if you speak now, you can't speak, you can't speak it because we're going to continue public hearing. When you advertise a public hearing and you say that, you're violating that advertisement says this is a time for the public to speak. The right thing would be doing, as far as public hearing, is when you continued public hearing, which you had done, have that public speak, but then you wanted to continue it, they have a right to speak at that continued public hearing. And that is a frustration that shouldn't have happened. I, by the way, was one member decided not to speak on infrastructure, because if I did then I wouldn't be able to see the additional information that would be coming out to be advantage for yourself and the public to be able to address. So I caution you from doing that. Now, last thing is, and I'm losing exactly how much time I've got, 50 seconds? Yeah. I came up with this line, that you believe the members of the public would be here if they wanted to, at these meetings. But remember what time of year we are in, the holiday season. People are engaged. Some operations dealing with deliveries and all that have added staff to deal with shipping. FedEx is usually one, UPS. They're very prominent in this community, in Anchorage. So, with all due respect, you should leave an opportunity understanding and understand that these people are focused on their business livelihood, and you did not do that with regard to some of these issues that were before you on this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else under audience participation? Yes, ma'am.
Sarah Oates with Alaska Char and representing myself. I would just like to say that I very much look forward to working with all of you in my new professional capacity and the mayor. And I also wanted to say happy birthday to Mr. Constant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, if I might, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Constant.
Just this morning, I witnessed some people conflating you as a state regulator of alcohol, and now you must be an enemy of marijuana because here you are representing Char. And so that points to me that this is a very new job, and you dove in at the deep end really quickly. And I wish you great fortune in this new work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're both audience participation, sir? Yes.
David McCarthy, I just want to thank everyone here sitting here for what they do for the community. Even though I was against some of the other issues, I'm very strong in supporting the fact that we do have issues in the community. And I fight every day to make those things happen. And I look forward to becoming more of a vocal voice in our community for this change, even though I spoke against what we were all talking about today. I just want to let you know our business is dedicated to make those changes. And thanks for the comments the other day. So thank you very much.
Chair, once again,
Thank
I
you,
would
sir.
like also to thank you for your planned investments in the downtown, that you have stepped up unlike almost anyone else other than the new marijuana industry, and are showing that you have faith in our community and in our downtown. And it's a bright light in the city. Thank you.
Yeah, economic change can happen, and I understand that we may take these other things to a vote, and I'll listen to the people, and we will definitely support it. But I just want to make sure, as we talked, Mr. Wendelton said, it's a bigger issue, and maybe we're taking a little piece of the pie by making this move forward. And seeing that we're fighting against it, it's just there is real costs, and I appreciate you bringing up some of those comments earlier, that there are true costs to the business, and I hope that eventually we can take a look at that.
Your last name is?
McCarthy,
that's
MCCARTHY.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, sir. What we do is you speak and then Mr. Constant comments. So,
And those are my constituents.
okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm Sterling Gallagher. Back in ancient history, I was a commissioner of revenue for the state. And after that, I was one of the investment bankers in the state, and I had the privilege of underwriting the Port of Anchorage. And we took it in the 60s, the Port of Anchorage was built on property tax bonds. And then around 1970, it was financed on its own right. Then in the 70s, in the year about 2002, Whittier came into existence and cut a deal with one of the transporters, and that deal cut 20 to 30% of your volume out of your port. So now your port is no longer viable from a revenue viewpoint. And so that I think if you want to repair that port, you have to think differently about it, in that you have to have a regional port, pull in Matsu, Whittier, Seward, Valdez, and have and the railroad, because the railroad is the one party in this whole scheme that is the mischief maker. And if you put them all together in one authority, I think it can 100% of that $600 million that you need can be financed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service as well. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, just one note, not to you, sir, but it just must be incredibly frustrating to Mr. Haberman for not having enough time to speak at our meetings.
Any other audience participation? I'm not seeing any, so we'll close audience participation. That brings us to assembly comments. We can start with you, Ms. Borowski.
Yeah, you said it right. I'm never here for this part. And honestly, whenever I come to these meetings, I'm always so glad to be here. I know I never make it to this part because there's always marijuana and alcohol licenses. But I'm really grateful for all the support I have from everyone up here. And I'm really grateful that I have y'all to bounce ideas off of, thoughts off of, and I'm so lucky to have the Youth Advisory Commission behind me as well, and I hope to see some of you guys, maybe some new faces at the meetings. So yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you for serving. Mr. Weddleton?
We're really lucky that we were ending before 8 because we have an amazing opportunity this evening. There's a woman who lives in town who did original art in the very first version of Dungeons & Dragons, and she's at Bosco's autographing right now, and I'm excited to make it out of here and go meet her. 8 o'clock.
Can you top that, Mr. Dunbar?
No, I've got to go on a dungeon raid.
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
No comments from me.
Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to our newest member, Ms. Wemhoff. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to echo Ms. LaFrance's sentiment. I look forward to working with you, Ms. Wemhoff. Thank you.
Mr. Trainee, congratulations. You've been working on this issue for a long time.
Been working on this issue for a long time. I want to thank my colleagues for voting on this. I appreciate you guys having the confidence in the electorate to send to the electorate. And so thanks. We've been working on this for years. It's really nice to see this accomplished. Now it's going to be up to the electorate for them to tell us yay or nay, and then we'll go from there. But thank you.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to wish Mr. Constant a happy birthday and everyone else happy holidays.
Mr. Constant?
Thank you, and I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate you and Mr. Rivera, you, for your election as chair and vice chair. And while I don't promise to make it easy, I will make sure it's interesting. And so congratulations to you both, and Merry Christmas to everybody, or Happy Hanukkah, and all of it wrapped into one.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I appreciate that. New member Wemhoff.
Hey, you said it correct.
Yeah.
That was good. I wanted to say thank you to this body for considering me for the in this application process, and I also wanted to say two other things. Well, first of all, three other things. Happy birthday! But the caliber of the people you had in front of you earlier today made me very pleased to be a part of that community. I think there are a lot of people, and you could tell that their concerns were the Chugiak Eagle River and Northeast Muldoon community, and I believe that every single one of them had the intentions of doing good things for the community. So it really, I'm honored to have been in that group, and thank you for selecting me based on that group. I also wanted to, and I know she's not here, but someone tell her I said this. I want to thank Amy for being, as determined and full of conviction for her true values. I think the one thing I learned from Amy is that she understood the process. I often watched her stop to explain something so members of the audience would understand. And I always saw her as someone who read the material and knew what was going on. And I think that that's important that she knows that I noticed that as someone who watched assembly meetings. So I appreciate her in that. And I guess I appreciate her that she left a little early, Amy. And as she and I said on Facebook at one point, I made a comment that she'd left the building, and she told someone, no, not really. So maybe she's left the building, but she hasn't left the state. And so, but thank you again, and I look forward to learning a great deal, and I definitely look forward to serving Anchorage in this position.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Any objection? None, we're adjourned.